Hey, welcome back to the channel. My name's Adam, and in today's video we're going to be talking about what it takes to actually swap an RX8. So one of the main things before I get started then, with this channel, what I want to do is kind of show you the reality of some of these things. So when it comes to racing, but also modified vehicles like an LS swapped RX8, in reality, it takes a while, there's mistakes along the way, and we learn from those mistakes. Those mistakes are okay. And so I'm going to show you the behind the scenes and everything that happens. I'd love to be able to do videos where obviously in the video we get everything done from start to finish, it just works. But at least in my experience, that's not always how it happens. So hopefully you'll enjoy the story as we kind of go. One thing that mating the rack to the GM power steering pump does so is the pressure of the GM system is a lot higher, I understand. So because of that, it was basically overpowered. So it felt really kind of twitchy. So I ended up finding that Flying Miata, who again do a lot of V8 swaps on different vehicles, had this adapter that went from the GM pump to the rack, and it was perfect. It was basically reduces the orifice, as you can see in this picture, and goes to a much smaller orifice, which helps reduce that kind of flow and pressure, which reduces that feeling. The V8 Roses kit comes with a pump that replaces the stock pump, and then from there lines that run directly to the fuel rail via a filter, basically deadheading it. I did this initially, but I was having issues with high fuel pressures that were resulting in fuel trim issues in the ECU. The fuel pressure required by a GM fuel rail is 58 psi, and I was seeing fuel pressures way north of this. Spoiler alert, whatever you do, don't do what I did next. So in order to solve my fuel pressure issues, I fitted an external regulator that had a return line that ran back to the tank. This solved the fuel pressure issues, but I still had fuel trim issues in the ECU. I eventually worked out that the injectors the intake I was using came with were not for a stock LS3. They were way bigger. So after replacing those, that solved my fuel trim issues, but then I ran into some other problems. But that's a story for another day. Whatever you do, if you're using this kit, stick with the V8R solution. Okay, so here it is. I wanted to show you this before I take it apart so you can see what it looks like. So this is basically in the rear, so there's a front driver's seat, driver's side, so on the left hand side in the US vehicle. Basically to remove the seat you just lift up here, it removes it from these two clips, and then you get access to a panel which has got 4 screws, so you can see the 4 screws there, which you undo, then it lifts up and you disconnect the wiring loom. So there's a little clip on this side, so you undo that. From here you can see I've disconnected my return line, so this is the return line I put in from my fuel regulator, and then this is the actual feed line, so you just unclip that. There's a little green clip that just unclips, so you remove that, and then we need to remove this ring. Now there's a special tool, and so this just goes on with a 3/8 inch wrench, and this tool basically just allows you to turn that ring. Now according to the service manual you are meant to replace this. Mine is fairly new, I think I might be able to get away with it, but like I say, the manufacturer does recommend you replace this, and I believe the seal as well. Or it could be just if it doesn't torque up to a certain point. Alright, very quick demonstration on just how easy it is to remove that pump. So you remove the ring, lift it up, you disconnect an electrical connector and a pipe that goes across to the other side of the tank, which is for the other pickup because it's a saddle tank, and then you basically put everything back together. So I was doing this because I added that return line and I really shouldn't have done. That was a mistake on my part. Alright, I just thought I'd show you the fuel lines running under the car. So these are all the stock fuel lines. You can see there basically where the AN6 line goes in, and that goes directly through to a filter which is hidden by this shield. And so here's just kind of a view of that filter from the other side. So in terms of fuel system then, this is basically the single line that runs from the rear, goes through the filter, but then runs up onto the rail. And you can basically see the rail here has been replaced, but just a stock rail will work just as well. As everything's exposed underneath the car then, I had to make a couple of brackets to protect everything from road silt and dirt. So this is just thin aluminum that I've shaped and used self-tapping screws to put into place, which is enough protection both from the heat of the exhaust, but also any of the grime that comes off the road. This car had a DSC braking system, and I hadn't found anyone that was able to get this to work with an LS swap. I could have swapped this back for an ABS setup from an RX8, but that would have meant keeping the RX8 ECU. To keep things simple, I plumbed the master cylinder directly to the calipers. Not knowing what this might do to the balance, I also had to fit a Willwood proportioning valve. So this is where the ABS block, or DSC in this case, used to sit, and as you can see that's gone, and effectively it's just been replaced with lines that go from the master cylinder directly to the proportioning valve, and then from there that runs down into the AN3 lines, which run to the back, but then also run and split to go left and right. So you can see the 3 lines under there. So basically one line runs to the left caliper, another line runs to the right caliper, and then another one for the rear. The only other thing you need to connect up and worry about is the actual brake booster. So with this, because this has a check valve in it from the RX8, you can see the check valve there. That basically stops on any backfires or anything, the booster becoming pressurized. You can basically see then that it was adapted to go into a line that effectively runs onto the back of the intake. So just around by that sensor there, you can see the line that goes onto the intake. So that actually works out very well. And coincidentally, it was when I was playing with that, was when I worked out I had the issue I'll talk about in a minute. I was using AN3 braking lines, so they had to adapt from AN3 to 10x1 with the correct flare. The clutch master cylinder also needs to be replaced, and the V8 Roadsters kit comes with one that's easy to plumb in. You also need to plumb in a reservoir then, or put it directly into the RX8 reservoir like an OEM setup. There's also a remote bleeding line that is easy to fit and gets tucked away in the loom. So this is the clutch slave cylinder. Now this actually has a reservoir on it, but you can plumb that directly into the master cylinder of the brakes and runs out the same reservoir. There is an adapter that comes with the kit. I might end up switching back to that, but for now this is working. Here though is where you see the bleeder for the clutch itself. So that just runs down and that just provides you with a remote bleeder. It just tucks up nicely in there, so that works. The stock RX8 brakes are actually very good, and there are a lot of LS swaps out there, I understand, using the stock brakes. Not knowing if this car was going to be used on track and not wanting to do a job twice, I opted to upgrade the front calipers and match those being used on the Miata. The kit itself comes from Kaiser Automation and actually saves, in terms of unsprung weight, a total of £6. The new calipers were matched with EBC discs and G-lock pads. Basically, you know, this is just going to show the fact that we've got the Willwood calipers and then the EBC rotors, and then kind of see the G-lock brakes. So that's at the front. As you can see, the same on the Miata, which is awesome. And then the stock rear calipers, EBC rotors. But one thing to note about brakes is, especially when you're putting in new pads for an RX8, as you wind back in that piston on the rear, make sure you loosen up the dust cover. Otherwise you're going to run into a lot of issues later. So here's a what looks bad and what looks good. The additional weight and power would have pushed the stock RX8 wheels and tyres to their limits. I wanted to find the widest wheel and tyre combo I could without having to flare the arches. I already had the Öhlins shocks from a previous build, and this allowed the right ride height to be set for the MR147 CM7 wheels with a 45mm offset. These were wrapped with 265/35/18 tyres. This is a habit from tracking on a budget, but I always like to have a square setup if I can. This seems to be the best balance whilst allowing flexibility. And so you can see here just a shot when it's on the lift of the new wheels and tyres mounted. Not had any rubbing issues, which has been great. There are a number of different options out there when it comes to the ECU. My primary goal with this build was for a street car, so I opted to use a GM Performance crate engine ECU and wiring loom. The advantage of this is a wiring loom is dedicated to run just the engine, and the ECU is already unlocked, so it doesn't require much tweaking to run out the box. I intended to use the car in all conditions, so I fitted NOx sensors, O2 sensors, and left the tune closed loop. The loom comes with a throttle pedal and it's compatible with the LS2 style throttle body. You have to pay attention to the injector connector type as well as the alternator connector, but apart from that it's pretty much plug and play.
So you can see here then that the throttle pedal itself is actually a very good fit. And it just works really well in that position.
No, I don't think so, and that shows you just how
LS2 style throttle body. This is the connector for the electronic throttle connection. And then here you can see the injectors.
An important thing to check at this point is you've connected up the appropriate grounds. You should have at least one ground strap from the chassis to the engine, and this particular loom had 2 ground connectors. I had a nightmare on initial startup as these were not connected, and whilst the engine ran, when it got hot it would start to cut out. I only found them because when I was plumbing in the brake booster to the intake, I noticed the throttle body ticking, and so I started to investigate.
So I've actually got a ground strap here that runs from there, excuse the mess, but that's actually connected to the chassis, to the head. There's another one that runs back here, probably not necessary.
To wire in the GM loom to the rest of the RX8 loom, you have to connect in the accessory online, the check engine light, as well as the fan controls. Now the RX8 fan controls actually has 3 speeds based on the output of a couple of relays. It's pretty confusing, so take your time on that one.
And then you can see down here the main OEM wiring loom for the fan. Okay, so I'll do my best to explain this one. So basically, if relay number 1 is on, so that's PCM20 connection is made, both motors will run, but they'll run at a slower rate because they're connected in series. So they're connected to the same voltage, twice the amount of resistance, they'll run slower. If you make the connection for the cooling fan relay number 2 by itself, so that's PCM19, just the cooling fan motor number 2 will turn on. If you make both connections, so that's cooling fan relay number 1 and cooling relay fan number 2, so that's PCM connections 20 and 19, both motors will turn on at the full rate. So what I did was I basically wired that up directly to the GM ECU.
The vehicle speed connector connects into the sensor on the gearbox, and at this point I also wired in the T56 reverse lockout. That's very important. Part numbers for the GM pins, as well as the waterproof gasket that goes around the wire, will be found below. The battery is relocated to the boot, and from there goes to the starter motor. From the starter motor it goes to the RX8 and GM looms.
And then the line from the starter goes down behind the exhaust, all the way along the frame rail, and then back up above the subframe, so that was done when the subframe was out. Probably easiest to be done when the subframe's out. You see what's attached there, and then goes into the trunk.
I still need to rotate the battery in the trunk, as I'm not happy at how close those terminals are to the battery brace itself. From there, don't forget to connect the starter motors to the alternator. Just ask me how I know.
So here is the alternator connector you need to worry about, and the particular pin out. The other thing you need to worry about is actually connecting up the alternator. Where is it? There. You see this connector at the top? That line basically runs down here, runs under the engine, all the way across to the starter.
Many people opt to put the ECU behind the dashboard. I couldn't find a great place for it, so I put it behind the washer bottle in the engine bay. It's actually a perfect fit, almost like it was designed for it. For street builds, I like to use an OEM ECU. These have the heritage of being used in street vehicles used for decades and hundreds of thousands of miles. They're waterproof, and so it's not a problem if they're mounted in the engine bay. The loom comes with a small fuse box, and this was easy to mount by the shock tower.
Basically the ECU is back there, tucked away nicely, with the loom running down here to the fuse box, and then from there it runs along the back, behind the intake, all the way over this way, and then I've got some sensors that run down here, and down into the engine, and then some other lines that run into the cabin itself.
To get the dash hooked in, I use the RX8 cluster commander. This is a product of David from the RX8club.com board. The wiring itself is pretty straightforward and hijacks a CAN connection from the GM ECU. It takes a couple of lines from behind the dash and is fully configurable. David has also been really easy to work with if I had any questions or problems. Basically it takes CAN lines and other analog lines into it to then translate and actually push out on the dash. So it works really, really well. It's a fantastic little device, and you can configure things. So you can configure things like the pressure settings that you want the gauge to actually move from. You can calibrate speed. You can do so much in there. I've been spoilt from racing, where the cars tend to have a gauge for all the important measurements. I wanted the same for the RX8, but I wanted it to have an OEM look. I ended up finding a 2-inch Banks dash monster that connects to a ton of analog sensors and also reads OBD2 CAN data. Perfect. I combined this with a couple of AEM wideband gauges and found a Racing Beat gauge pod that replaces the ashtray. Sorted! This gives me direct access to coolant temperature, oil pressure, RPM, speed, battery voltage and lots more. Perhaps not necessary, but in order to make sure everything is tucked away nicely, to fit everything like this, I ended up removing the dash. With everything buttoned up and zip ties used galore to make sure everything is tidy, the final touch for the interior is a good old shift knob. So I ended up finding this awesome Tremec shifter knob, and I'll put a link below because it just looks fantastic. And that's it. I'm sure I've missed something, but that's the majority of the work that you need to do to LS swap your own RX8, especially if you use the V8 Roadsters kit. Feel free to post any questions you may have below, and I will do my best to reply to each one. I mentioned this in the first video, but other useful resources include the RX8club.com forum and the LS Powered RX8 Facebook group. Special thanks goes out to Stubbs on the forum and George on the Facebook group, as well as David from RX8 Cluster Commander. I encourage you to subscribe, like and share with your friends. There's a ton more videos coming. Sorry this one took so long, but I wanted to make sure I covered every aspect of the project. I know that would have helped me out a ton when I was building my car. Have a great day.